A poor woman helps a millionaire fix his Ferrari, but when he saw her ring, he fainted. The sun was beginning to set in Newport, painting the sky with orange hues that reflected on the calm waters of the sea. Emily walked along the dirt road that snaked between imposing mansions and humble fishermen's houses, carrying her sewing box. At 45, her calloused hands told stories of a life dedicated to hard work, but her green eyes still maintained a glimmer of hope. The wind blew strongly that autumn afternoon, bringing dark clouds that threatened to pour down at any moment. Emily quickened her pace, adjusting the worn shawl over her shoulders. She needed to save on bus fare to buy medicine for her husband, Peter, who had been bedridden for months due to a mysterious illness that local doctors couldn't diagnose. As she walked, her thoughts wandered between worries about the accumulating bills and the joy of having her granddaughter, Sophie, living with her since her daughter got a job in Boston. The 16-year-old girl was her light, always bringing smiles even on the most difficult days. The roar of a powerful engine interrupted her thoughts. A gleaming red Ferrari passed by her at high speed, but soon slowed down, making a strange noise before stopping completely a few meters ahead. Emily observed as an elegant man, wearing an impeccable Italian suit, got out of the car visibly irritated. "No, I can't wait 3 hours. I have an important meeting in less than an hour," she heard him yell into his phone as she approached. The man, who appeared to be about 50 years old, ran his hands through his graying hair in frustration. Emily hesitated for a moment, but something prompted her to approach. "Excuse me, sir, perhaps I can help," she offered timidly. The man, who introduced himself as Richard Miller, looked her up and down suspiciously. His gaze lingered on her simple clothes and the sewing box she carried. "Ma'am, this is a Ferrari. It's not exactly a sewing machine," he said with a tone of superiority. "My father was a mechanic," Emily responded calmly, ignoring the mockery. "He taught me everything he knew since I was little. I can at least take a look." After several more frustrated attempts to get a specialized mechanic, Richard finally gave in. Emily placed her sewing box on the ground and asked him to open the hood. The smell of burned oil immediately reached her nostrils. With precise movements, she began examining the engine. Her experienced eyes quickly identified the problem. A loose part was causing overheating. To better handle the small parts, Emily removed her worn gloves, revealing a golden ring with an emerald stone that gleamed under the evening light. Richard, who was observing her movements with increasing interest, froze upon seeing the jewel. His face turned pale as if he had seen a ghost. That ring, it was impossible. It was identical to the one he had given to his mother so many years ago, a unique piece that had disappeared when she departed this world. "Done," Emily announced after a few minutes, cleaning her hands on a piece of cloth. "I made a temporary repair. The car should run normally now, but I recommend taking it to a specialized garage as soon as possible." Richard was still stunned, his eyes fixed on the ring. Trying to maintain his composure, he took his wallet from his pocket. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," Emily answered, putting her gloves back on. "It was a pleasure to help." "Wait," Richard called when she was already turning to leave. "I have a proposal for you. I own a collection of vintage cars that need regular maintenance. I'm looking for someone with technical knowledge and dedication." The rain began to fall softly, but neither of them moved. Emily thought about Peter, the expensive medications, the overdue bills. "How much would you pay?" "Enough so you won't have to walk miles to save on bus fare," he answered, a half smile appearing on his lips. The Miller estate was an imposing construction by the sea, with meticulously maintained gardens and a garage that looked more like an automotive museum. Emily arrived for her first day of work wearing her best clothes, though these were still too simple for the standards of that place. Mary, the housekeeper, greeted her with a warm smile, but Emily couldn't help noticing the curious glances from other employees. It wasn't common to see someone from the Harbour District working in the luxury car wing of the estate. "Mr. Miller left specific instructions," Mary explained as she guided her through the property. "You'll have full access to the garage and tools. He trusts you'll know how to take care of the collection." The garage was a spectacle of its own. Various perfectly preserved classic cars were aligned under special lighting. Emily felt her heart race at seeing so many automotive masterpieces gathered in one place. Her father would have loved to be there. "Grandma," Sophie's voice echoed. Through the garage, her granddaughter had insisted on accompanying her on the first day, curious to see the place where her grandmother would work. "This place is amazing." "Sophie, behave yourself," Emily gently warned, but couldn't contain a smile at seeing the girl's enthusiasm. "Let her explore," Richard's deep voice sounded behind them. He had arrived silently and was observing the scene with interest. "As long as she doesn't touch anything, of course." Sophie blushed slightly, but her eyes sparkled when she noticed the library visible through the mansion's glass doors. Richard noticed her interest. "Do you like books?" "I love literature," Sophie responded enthusiastically. "I'm rereading Wuthering Heights for the third time." A flash of emotion crossed Richard's normally impassive face. "It was my mother's favorite book," he murmured, more to himself than to the others present. Emily observed the interaction with curiosity. There was something different in the way Richard looked at Sophie, a mixture of fascination and melancholy that she couldn't decipher. Days turned into weeks, and Emily quickly proved her worth. Her skilled hands brought problematic engines back to life, and her dedication impressed even the most skeptical. Richard began making frequent visits to the garage, always with a different excuse, but Emily noticed that his eyes invariably sought the ring on her hand. One afternoon, while working on an antique Jaguar, Emily heard voices coming from the library. It was Sophie, engaged in an animated literary discussion with Richard. The girl had been authorized to use the library after school, and gradually, an unlikely friendship began to blossom between the teenager and the lonely businessman. "Your granddaughter is a remarkable young woman," Richard commented to Emily later. "She reminds me of someone. She has the same gestures, the same way of furrowing her brow when she's concentrating." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something in his tone of voice, an unasked question hanging in the air. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by Mary, who brought urgent news from the hospital where Peter was admitted. "The machines malfunctioned," the housekeeper explained, handing a phone to Emily. "The doctor wants to speak with you." Emily's face paled upon hearing the news. Peter's treatment would need to be extended, which meant more expenses. She looked at her calloused hands, at the ring that gleamed on her finger, an inheritance from her mother that held as many secrets as fate itself seemed to hold for her. Richard observed everything from a distance, his countenance thoughtful. Something was beginning to connect in his mind, pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed, until he found that simple woman with a ring that had belonged to his mother. As the months passed, Emily's routine was divided between mornings in the EE, Mansion's workshop, and afternoons in her small sewing studio, which she insisted on maintaining as a way to preserve her independence. The generous salary Richard paid allowed her to keep Peter's treatment up to date, but something beyond money tied her to that place. On a particularly hot afternoon, while Sophie was studying in the library, Emily was called to the main office of the mansion. It was the first time she entered that austere environment, decorated with noble wood furniture and black and white photographs. Richard wasn't there, and Mary asked her to organize some documents that had been damaged by a leak. "Mr. Miller trusts you," said the housekeeper before leaving. "He has never allowed anyone but me to enter here." While organizing the folders, a yellowed envelope slipped from one of them. Emily picked it up, and inadvertently, some old photographs scattered on the floor. Her heart almost stopped when she saw one of the images, her mother, young and smiling, next to an elegant woman who seemed strangely familiar to her. "Grandma, you won't believe it." Sophie burst into the office, making Emily hastily put the photograph back in the envelope. "Mr. Richard has first editions of all the English classics, and he said I can read any of them." Emily observed her granddaughter speaking animatedly about the books, noticing for the first time how her gestures were similar to Richard's when he got excited about something. The same way of moving her hands, the same tilt of the head. "Sophie, dear," Emily gently interrupted, "do you remember that old box your great-grandmother left? The one with the photos and letters? The one in our attic?" "Yes, I remember. Why?" "When we get home, I'd like you to help me find it." That night, after Sophie fell asleep, Emily examined the contents of the box by the dim light of a lamp. Among yellowed photographs and old letters, she found her mother's diary. The pages were fragile, and the delicate handwriting told stories she had never known. "My dear daughter," one of the entries began, "there are secrets we carry not out of shame but for protection. The ring that will one day be yours carries a story greater than you can imagine." Emily couldn't continue reading. Her hands were trembling so much that she feared damaging the old pages. Her mother's words seemed to gain new meaning now, decades later. The next day, upon arriving at the mansion, Emily noticed a different movement. Employees were running from one side to the other, and Mary seemed especially agitated. "Mr. George is coming back," murmured one of the gardeners as she passed. "Who is Mr. George?" Emily asked Mary when she found her. "The former butler," answered the housekeeper, her face showing concern. "He worked for the Miller family for more than 30 years, knew all the secrets of the house. He left 5 years ago after a disagreement with Mr. Richard." Before Emily could ask more questions, Richard appeared in the hallway. His face was tense, and for the first time since she had started working there, he seemed truly disturbed. "Emily," he called, his voice deeper than normal. "I need you to organize a charity event we'll be holding here at the estate next weekend. It will be an auction of one of the cars from the collection, and the money will be donated to the local hospital." She nodded, but realized there was something more behind his request. Richard continued staring fixedly at her hands, at the ring that gleamed under the sunlight coming through the tall windows. "That ring," he began, but was interrupted by Sophie, who came running into the hallway. "Grandma, Dad is better, the doctor just called," exclaimed the girl, hugging Emily tightly. The moment of tension dissipated, but Emily knew something was about to change. The return of the former butler, the discovered photographs, the words in her mother's diary, everything seemed to converge toward a revelation that she wasn't sure if she was prepared to face. The day of the charity event arrived, bringing with it an atmosphere of expectation that hovered over the mansion like a dense cloud. The gardens had been decorated with delicate lights, and elegant tables were arranged around the pool. Newport's high society turned out in full force, curious to see the rare 1964 Aston Martin DB5 that would be auctioned. Emily was supervising the final details when she noticed an elderly man standing near the garage entrance, observing her with uncomfortable intensity. His astute eyes seemed to pierce her soul, and she instantly knew that this must be George, the former butler. "So it's you," he said, approaching with slow but firm steps, the mechanic who gained Mr. Richard's trust. There was something in his voice, a tone of veiled accusation that made Emily feel uncomfortable. Before she could respond, Sophie appeared, dazzling in a blue dress that Emily had sewn especially for the occasion. "Grandma, Mr. Richard is looking for you. He wants you to present the car at the auction, since you were the one who restored it." George's face paled upon hearing Sophie call Emily grandmother, his eyes fixed on the ring on her hand, and an expression of recognition crossed his countenance. "Impossible," he murmured, taking a step back. "That ring. I remember perfectly the day Mrs. Elizabeth lost it, or rather, the day it was stolen." His voice rose with the last words, attracting the attention of nearby guests. Emily felt the blood freeze in her veins. "What's happening here?" Richard appeared beside them, his expression oscillating between concern and irritation. "Mr. Richard." George turned to his former employer, his voice trembling with indignation. "This woman is wearing your mother's ring, the ring that mysteriously disappeared after—" "Enough," Richard interrupted him abruptly, but it was too late. Whispers were already spreading among the guests like wildfire. Emily remained motionless, feeling accusatory glances upon her. Her hands trembled, but her voice came out firm when she finally spoke. "This ring was a gift from my mother. She received it as payment for a special service she provided many years ago." "What kind of service would justify giving away a family heirloom?" questioned a high society lady, her voice loaded with disdain. Richard's face had lost all color. He stared fixedly at Emily, as if seeing her for the first time. Sophie, sensing the tension, approached her grandmother and held her hand. "Let's go to my office," Richard finally said, his voice low but authoritative. "George, you too." As they walked into the mansion, Emily could feel the weight of the secrets she was about to reveal. Her mother's diary words echoed in her mind, along with fragments of long-buried memories, mysterious visits from an elegant woman, gifts left on special dates, whispered conversations that ceased when she entered the room. In the office, Richard closed the door and poured himself a glass of whiskey before turning to Emily. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw in them not the cold, calculating businessman, but a man tormented by unanswered questions. "Emily," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I think it's time we discovered the truth about this ring, and about much more than that." George remained standing near the door, his countenance a mask of conflict between loyalty and revelation. Sophie, who had refused to stay outside, held her grandmother's hand tightly, as if trying to transmit courage to her. The storm forming outside seemed to mirror the emotional tempest that was about to unleash in that room. Emily touched the ring on her finger, feeling its weight not just physically, but also the weight of the truths it carried. It was time to reveal secrets kept for decades, even if this would forever change the destiny of everyone present. Brief. Silence in the office was as dense as fog on a winter morning. Emily took a deep breath, gathering courage to share the story that her mother had entrusted to her in her final moments. "My mother worked in this mansion for many years," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Not just as a housekeeper, but as your mother's confidant, Mr. Richard." Richard sat heavily in his leather armchair, eyes fixed on Emily. George remained near the door, his countenance oscillating between surprise and understanding. "Elizabeth Miller," Emily continued, "your mother had a generous heart. She secretly helped several families from the fishing community, but there was more than that." Emily opened her purse and took out her mother's worn diary. The yellowed pages trembled in her hands as she searched for a specific entry. "Today, Elizabeth entrusted me with her greatest secret," read Emily. "She needs my help to maintain contact with someone very special, someone her husband could never discover." Sophie, who was sitting on a small sofa near the window, observed the scene with wide eyes. The storm forming outside began to beat against the windows forcefully, as if wanting to participate in the revelation. "This ring," Emily touched the jewel on her finger, "was not stolen. It was a gift of gratitude for the service my mother provided for years, keeping in secret something that could have destroyed the Miller family's reputation." Richard rose abruptly, walking to an old mahogany writing desk. With trembling hands, he opened a secret drawer and took out a blue velvet box. "My mother always said this set was unique," he said, opening the box to reveal a necklace with an emerald stone identical to the one in the ring. "She had it specially made during a trip to Europe. It was her most precious treasure." "Mr. Richard," George interrupted, his voice laden with emotion, "there's something I need to confess. I knew about your mother's secret visits to the fishing village. I saw her several times talking with a young woman who had the same green eyes as—" A thunderous boom cut off his speech, causing the office lights to flicker. Sophie approached her grandmother, her eyes fixed on the box Richard was holding. "Grandma," she whispered, "that old bracelet you keep, the one great-grandma left?" Emily nodded slowly, rising to face Richard. "It's time we seek the complete truth. The bracelet I have at home. It completes this set." Richard staggered slightly, leaning on the desk. His eyes traversed Emily's face, then Sophie's, as if looking for something that had always been there, but that he had never noticed before. "My mother's mysterious visits," he murmured. "They always happened on the same day of the month, and she always returned with tears in her eyes, but smiling." Emily opened another page of the diary, her hands now firm. "Your mother had a secret, Mr. Richard. A secret she kept until her last day. She had another—" At that moment, the lights went out completely, plunging the office into darkness. The storm had knocked out the mansion's power. In the gloom, illuminated only by occasional lightning, those present could feel the weight of the truth about to be revealed. Mary burst into the office with lit candles. "Mr. Richard, the storm is getting worse. The documents in the basement. Water is starting to come in. Richard turned pale. The family's old archives are down there. He turned to Emily, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. We need to save them before it's too late. As they descended the stairs toward the basement, Emily felt that those documents held more than just the official history of the Miller family. Somewhere among those old pages was the key to a secret that would change their lives forever. The water was already reaching their ankles when they arrived at the basement. Richard, Emily, and Mary worked frantically to save the boxes of documents, while Sophie held a flashlight, illuminating the way. George remained at the top of the stairs, his grave expression revealing that he knew more than he was, saying, "There!" shouted Richard, pointing to an old shelf. "The blue box with the family crest. We need to get it." Emily plunged into the cold water, reaching the box moments before a new wave of water hit it. When she opened it, her eyes widened. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to a certain Catherine Sanders. "Catherine," whispered Emily, her voice trembling. "That was my mother's name." Richard snatched one of the letters from her hands, his fingers trembling as he tore, opened the yellowed envelope. In the flickering light of the flashlight, he began to read, "My dear Catherine, how it hurts to have to keep our meetings secret. But you know why we need to act this way. Emily is growing up so beautifully, has the same green eyes that—" Richard's voice failed. He looked at Emily, then at Sophie, as if finally understanding something that had been before his eyes all along. "Mr. Richard," Mary intervened, her voice gentle but firm, "there's something I need to tell you. Your mother made me promise that I would only reveal it if circumstances demanded." The storm roared outside, but inside the basement, the silence was deafening. Mary continued, "Mrs. Elizabeth had a daughter before marrying your father. A daughter from her first love, a young fisherman who fell ill before they could marry. She was forced by her family to hide the pregnancy, and the child was raised by Catherine, who was her best friend and confidant." Emily felt her legs weaken. Sophie supported her, her eyes wide with understanding. "Grandma," whispered Sophie, "it means your grandmother is my sister," Richard completed, his voice choked. "Half-sister." The sound of something falling upstairs startled them. George descended the stairs hastily. "The guests from the event," he exclaimed. "They're all trapped in the main hall due to the storm." Richard barely seemed to hear. His eyes were fixed on a photograph he had found among the letters. His mother, young and radiant, holding a baby in her arms, with Catherine at her side. On the back, a date and a message. "My two greatest blessings, Elizabeth." "That's why she always looked after us from a distance," Emily murmured, tears streaming down her face. "The mysterious gifts, the secret visits. She never completely abandoned us." "And the ring." Richard touched the jewel on Emily's finger with reverence. "She must have given it to Catherine so that one day it would reach you, her true heir." An even stronger boom shook the mansion. The water in the basement continued to rise. "We need to get out of here," Mary warned. "The structure may not hold." As they climbed the stairs, carrying the boxes with the precious documents, Emily and Richard exchanged a profound look. Decades of secrets were coming to light along with the storm that was punishing Newport. But instead of destruction, these revelations brought with them the promise of a new story. In the main hall, the guests of the charity event waited, oblivious, to the family drama unfolding in the mansion's basement. Among themselves, they commented on the strange behavior of the host and the mysterious mechanic with the valuable ring. Little did they know that, on that stormy night, much more than a simple car auction was changing forever. The days that followed the storm brought a peculiar silence to the Miller estate. Richard had isolated himself in his office, immersing himself in the documents and letters saved from the basement, trying to reconstruct a history he had never imagined existed. Emily, meanwhile, continued her work in the garage, but something had fundamentally changed in her relationship with that place. "He didn't come down for breakfast again today either," Mary commented, entering the garage where Emily was carefully polishing the bumper of an antique Rolls-Royce. "He's been like that since that night." Emily nodded silently, understanding the complexity of the situation. It wasn't easy to discover that your entire family history had been built on secrets and half-truths. Mr. Richard asked me to give this to you, Mary continued, extending a thick envelope. He said he found it among Mrs. Elizabeth's letters. With slightly trembling hands, Emily opened the envelope. Inside were several old photographs and a diary different from the one her mother had left. It was Elizabeth Miller's personal diary. "Grandma!" Sophie's animated voice echoed through the garage. "Dad was discharged from the hospital. He's coming home today." The news should have filled Emily with joy, but her heart was divided between happiness for her husband and the anguish of recent revelations. Sophie, noticing her grandmother's distant expression, approached and picked up one of the photographs. "Is this Mrs. Elizabeth?" she asked, observing the image of an elegant woman seated on a park bench. "She has the same smile as Mr. Richard. And yours too, Grandma." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. The photograph had been taken on the day of her birth, as indicated by the date written on the back. Elizabeth was holding a small bundle in her arms, her face radiant with happiness. "Sophie," Emily called softly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about our family." Before she could continue, they were interrupted by heavy footsteps at the entrance to the garage. Richard was standing there, his countenance more haggard than usual, holding a folder of documents. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice hoarse, "but I think we need to talk, all of us." In the office, Richard served tea in fine porcelain cups, a habit he had inherited from his mother. Sophie sat between him and Emily, her curious eyes alternating between the two. "I've spent the last few days reading every letter, every note," Richard began, his voice softer than usual. "Our mother, Elizabeth, she kept a detailed record of everything, of how she met your father, Emily, a young fisherman who made her believe in true love, of how she was forced by her family to distance herself from him when she discovered the pregnancy." Emily held the cup so tightly that her fingers were white. Richard continued. "She wrote about how Catherine, your adoptive mother, and her best friend offered to raise you as her own daughter, allowing Elizabeth to at least stay close, even if in secret." "That's why the gifts," murmured Emily. "The mysterious visits?" "Yes," Richard nodded. "And when she married my father, she made Catherine promise that she would never reveal the truth. It was a different time, and the scandal could destroy not just the family's reputation, but especially your life, Emily. She wanted you to grow up free from the weight of the Miller name." Sophie, who had remained silent until then, took her grandmother's hand and Richard's, uniting them over the table. "So now we're really a family?" she asked, her voice laden with hope. Richard looked at their joined hands, at the ring that glinted on Emily's finger, the ring his mother had left as a clue, a tangible connection between the two worlds she had inhabited. "Actually," he answered, his voice choked, "we always were, we just didn't know it." The sound of a familiar honk interrupted the moment. Through the window they could see a taxi stopping in front of the mansion. Peter was coming home. Peter's arrival brought a new dynamic to the already complex situation. After months of treatment, he was returning home stronger, but still needing care. Emily settled him in the main bedroom of their simple house, while her mind buzzed with all the revelations of the past few days. "You're different," Peter commented, watching his wife arrange the pillows. "There's something in your eyes, restlessness that wasn't there before." Emily sat on the edge of the bed holding her husband's hand. How to explain to him that her life had been turned upside down? That the story she had always believed to be hers had transformed into something completely different. "Peter," she began, her voice soft, "remember when we met? You said there was something special about me, something you couldn't explain." "Of course I remember," he smiled. "I said you had an air of nobility, even wearing simple clothes, that you seemed to be in the wrong place." "And what if I was?" Emily asked, tears glistening in her eyes. "What if I told you that I discovered who I really am?" Meanwhile, at the mansion, Richard faced his own dilemmas. In his office, he examined old company documents, his face tense in the lamplight. "Mr. Richard," Mary entered after knocking softly. On the door, "The family lawyer is here." Mr. Alexander, a distinguished gentleman with graying hair, entered carrying a leather folder. Richard, I analyzed the documents you sent me. Legally speaking, Emily has a right to... This isn't about legal rights, Richard interrupted him. I want to do this the right way. She's my sister, not a legal matter to be resolved. The lawyer nodded understandingly. Even so, we need to regularize the situation. Your mother left specific instructions in her will, although at the time no one understood why. Sophie, who had become a constant presence at the mansion, was in the library when she heard raised voices coming from the hallway. George was arguing with someone on the phone. No, Mrs. Margaret, I don't think it's appropriate for you to come here now, he was saying, his voice tense. Mr. Richard is dealing with important family matters. Margaret Montgomery, the president of Newport Social Club and an old friend of the Miller family, was not known for accepting refusals. Within minutes, the sound of tires at the entrance announced her arrival. Richard, her shrill voice echoed through the hall. Is it true what they're saying, that mechanic is your sister? That Elizabeth had a daughter before the marriage? Richard emerged from the office, his face a mask of controlled irritation. Margaret, family matters should remain within the family. But darling, think of the scandal, the Miller reputation. Your father. My father is no longer here, Richard cut her off dryly. And as for the family's reputation, perhaps it's time we built a new one based on truth and not appearances. At that moment, Emily entered the mansion, her face marked by recent tears. She had just told everything to Peter, and her heart was still heavy with the intensity of the moment. Margaret stared at her with barely disguised disdain, but something in Emily's posture made her hesitate. There was a natural dignity in her, bearing, an elegance that no simple clothes could hide. Emily, Richard approached his sister, positioning himself protectively at her side. I was just explaining to Margaret that some changes are coming to the Miller family. The ring on her finger caught the sunlight coming through the tall windows, casting green reflections on the walls. Emily looked at the jewel she had carried for so many years without understanding its true meaning. Now finally, she understood that it wasn't just a ring. It was a legacy, a bridge between two worlds that should never have been separated. The news about Emily's true identity spread through Newport like a sea breeze, reaching every corner of the small coastal city. In the fisherman's village where she had always lived, neighbors now looked at her differently, some with admiration, others with a poorly disguised hint of envy. Peter observed the changes with a mixture of pride and concern. Sitting on the porch of their simple house, still recovering from his treatment, he watched his wife divided between two worlds. Mornings at the Miller estate, now no longer as an employee, but as a legitimate part of the family, and afternoons in her small sewing studio, which she insisted on maintaining. You don't need to work so hard anymore, he said softly when Emily arrived home that afternoon. Richard offered. It's not about the money, she interrupted him, sitting by his side. It's about who I am. These hands, she showed her calloused palms, tell my story, the story that Catherine, my adoptive mother, taught me to honor. At the mansion, Richard faced his own challenges. The company's board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss the implications of the new heir. Gentlemen, Richard began, his firm voice echoing through the meeting room, I know some of you have concerns about how this situation might affect the family business. Concerns is an understatement, Richard, interrupted Charles Anderson, the oldest board member. We have shareholders to satisfy, a decades-old reputation to protect. And now you want to include in the corporate structure a mechanic? Richard felt his blood boil but maintained his composure. This mechanic, as you call her, is my sister, the daughter of Elizabeth Miller, and she has more integrity and intelligence than many I know. The discussion was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Sophie, accompanied by Mary. The expression on the housekeeper's face indicated that something serious had happened. Uncle Richard, Sophie rarely called him that, still getting used to the new relationship. We found something in the attic, something I think you all need to see. In the dusty old attic, among trunks and furniture covered by sheets, Mary had discovered a safe hidden behind a wooden panel. Inside, besides documents and jewelry, There was an envelope addressed to my 2 children. "It's her handwriting," Richard murmured, recognizing his mother's elegant calligraphy. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and began reading, aloud, "My beloved Richard and Emily, if you are reading this letter, it means the truth has finally come to light. There are no words to express how much it pains me not to have been able to raise you 2 together, as should have been. But the circumstances and conventions of the time forced me to make painful choices. Richard, my son, you inherited your father's strength and my determination. But there's something you've always lacked, the ability to see beyond appearances, to recognize the true value of people. Emily grew up having to prove her worth every day, and that made her extraordinary. Emily, my green-eyed girl, you carry not just my ring, but my free spirit and my love for simple life. Catherine, my dear friend, raised you with all the love that I could not openly demonstrate, but your place was always here too. What I leave for you is not just a name or a material inheritance. It's the chance to correct the mistakes of the past, to unite what should never have been separated. The family company need not be just a financial empire. It can be an instrument of transformation. Along with this letter, I leave documents that confirm my wish that the Miller estate also become a professional training center where young people from the community can learn trades and have opportunities that I in life could not provide to everyone. With eternal love, Elizabeth Miller. The silence that followed the reading was broken only by the distant sound of ocean waves. Richard looked at Sophie, who smiled through tears, then at Mary, who nodded with approval, and finally at the board members who had come up to the attic after hearing about the discovery. "Well, gentlemen," he said, his voice loaded with emotion and determination, "I think we now have a new direction for the Miller Company." Charles Anderson cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Richard, be reasonable. Transforming the mansion into a school, it's exactly what we'll do," a firm voice sounded from the attic door. Emily was there, still wearing her work overalls, the emerald ring gleaming on her hand. "And believe me, gentlemen, it will be the best investment this family has ever made." The following weeks were ones of intense transformation at the Miller estate. While lawyers took care of the necessary paperwork to formalize the new company structure and Emily's recognition as a legitimate heir, the renovations of the mansion's east wing began at full steam. Emily personally supervised every detail of the remodeling, uniting her practical knowledge with the social vision she had inherited from Elizabeth. The professional training center project took shape, with modern workshops, classrooms, and even a small dormitory for students from more distant communities. "You have the same determined look she had," commented George, watching Emily examine the project plans. Mrs. Elizabeth also furrowed her brow that way when she was concentrated. Richard, who spent more and more time with his sister, discovered daily new traits that connected them. The passion for vintage cars, perfectionism in work, even the way of smiling. They were small mirrors of his mother that he now saw reflected in Emily. One afternoon, while organizing the last documents found in the attic, Sophie made a surprising discovery. "Grandma, look at this!" she exclaimed, holding a yellowed envelope. "They're photos of Mrs. Elizabeth when she was young, and there's a letter here too." The letter, written by Emily's father, revealed a side of the story that no one knew. The young fisherman, even knowing he could never be with Elizabeth due to the social conventions of the time, had promised to look after their daughter from afar. "So it was him," murmured Emily, remembering the gentleman who always appeared at the pier on her birthdays, leaving small gifts with Catherine. "My biological father never stopped watching over me." Peter, who was gradually regaining his strength, began to actively participate in the training center project. His experience as a former leader of the Fishermen's Association proved valuable for establishing bridges with the community. "You know," he said to Richard during a meeting, "when I married Emily, I felt I was uniting myself with someone special. Now I understand it wasn't just a feeling, it was the unconscious recognition of her true origin." The news of the transformation of the Miller estate into a professional training center caused a stir in Newport's high society. Margaret Montgomery, who had initially staunchly opposed the idea, was surprised to see her own grandchildren showing interest in the project. "Perhaps," she admitted during a tea with Emily, "we all needed this change. Newport has been stuck in time for too long, clinging to values that no longer make sense." One afternoon, as the sun was setting over the sea, Emily and Richard sat on the mansion's veranda, contemplating the comings and goings of the workers, who were working on the remodeling. "I found this among Mother's things," said Richard, handing Emily a small blue velvet box. Inside were a pair of earrings with emeralds identical to those of the ring and necklace. "The set is complete now," smiled Emily, touching the jewels with reverence. "No, my sister," Richard gently corrected. "Our family is what's complete now." Sophie, who was observing them from the door, smiled. In her hands she held a newly printed poster, "Elizabeth Miller Professional Training Center, transforming lives through education and work." The sea breeze brought the smell of salt water and new beginnings. On the horizon, the sunset colors seemed more vibrant, as if nature itself was celebrating the union of two halves long separated. The emerald ring on Emily's finger was no longer a mystery to be unraveled, but a symbol of a finally complete inheritance. 6 months had passed since the discovery of Elizabeth's letter. The Elizabeth Miller Professional Training Center was about to be inaugurated, and the old Miller estate pulsed with a different energy. The walls that once echoed only the silence of solitude now reverberated with animated voices and the sound of tools. Emily walked through the remodeled corridors, observing the final preparations for the inauguration ceremony. In the former garage, now transformed into a modern workshop, young apprentices were already participating in pilot classes, their eyes shining with the same passion she had for mechanics. "Miss Emily," called Joseph, a 17-year-old boy from the fishing village. "You need to see this." He proudly pointed to an engine he had managed to fix by himself after weeks of learning. "Excellent work," she smiled, recognizing in the young man the same enthusiasm her father had awakened in her so many years ago. "You have a natural gift for this." Richard, who was observing the scene from the door, felt his heart warm. His sister had transformed not just the mansion, but the entire dynamic of the Miller family. The company, which previously focused only on real estate businesses, now had a greater purpose. "Emily," he called softly, "there's something I need to show you before the inauguration." In the office, Richard opened a folder with the latest financial reports of the company. The board finally understood what Mother always knew. Investing in people is the best business we can do. The company's shares have risen 30% since we announced the training center project. Emily smiled, remembering the initial resistance. "It's not about the money, Richard. It's about making a difference," he completed. "I know, and that's why I've made a decision. From today, you'll be the executive director of the training center, and I won't accept no for an answer." Before Emily could respond, Sophie burst into the office, carrying an object covered by a cloth. "We managed to finish it in time," she exclaimed, removing the cloth to reveal a bronze plaque. On it, besides the center's name, was a quote, "To transform lives through knowledge and work, Elizabeth Miller." "Your grandmother would be proud," said Peter, who had entered right behind his granddaughter. His recovery was complete, and he now coordinated the center's sustainable fishing program. Mary appeared at the door, her eyes shining with emotion. "The first guests are arriving, and there's a surprise waiting in the garden." In the main garden, a crowd had already gathered for the inauguration ceremony. But what caught Emily's attention was a special group of people, former residents of the fishing village, all dressed in their best clothes, including an elderly gentleman whom she immediately recognized. "Jack," she whispered, approaching the man who for years had left small gifts on her birthdays. Her biological father, now over 80 years old, smiled with tears in his eyes. "My daughter," he said simply, opening his arms. The embrace that followed carried decades of silent love, of discreet care, of a presence that, although distant, had never ceased to exist. Richard observed the scene, finally understanding the true meaning of family. It wasn't just the blood ties or the Miller name that united them, but something much deeper. The love that Elizabeth had planted in each of them, now flourishing in ways she might never have imagined. George, who had become one of the project's greatest supporters, approached with an envelope in his hands. "I found this morning in a secret compartment of Mrs. Elizabeth's old vanity. I think she would want you to read it today." Emily and Richard looked at each other, recognizing the elegant handwriting on the envelope. It was another letter, from their mother, as if she knew this moment would come. Emily's voice trembled slightly as she opened the last envelope left by Elizabeth. Around her, the reunited family, not just Richard and Sophie, but also Peter, Jack, Mary, George, and all those who had become part of this story, waited in reverent silence. "My dear ones, if this letter is being read, it means my dream has finally come true. The Miller estate, which for so long was a symbol of division and privilege, has transformed into a bridge between worlds that should never have been separated. Emily, my brave daughter, your father Jack taught me that a person's true value isn't in the name they carry, but in the marks they leave on the world. You inherited this wisdom from him and from me, I hope, the strength to fight for what you believe. Richard, my sensitive boy who hid for so long behind a mask of coldness, you finally found what you always sought, a family that goes far beyond blood ties or social conventions. The ring that Emily carries, the necklace that Richard kept, and the earrings that now complete the set are not just jewels, they are parts of a love story that transcended prejudice and social barriers. A story that you now continue in a way that I could never have imagined. Sophie, my sweet great-granddaughter, you are living proof that the future can be different from the past. Your curiosity and your open heart are the seeds of a more just and welcoming world. To all who are part of this family, whether by blood, choice, or destiny, I leave my gratitude and my blessing. The training center is just the beginning of a new era for the Millers, an era in which doors don't separate but unite, in which differences don't divide but enrich. With eternal love, Elizabeth Miller. When Emily finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Richard, who rarely showed emotions in public, hugged his sister tightly. Sophie joined the embrace, followed by Peter and Jack. One by one, all those present united in that moment of celebration. The inauguration ceremony that followed was more than a formal event. It was the celebration of a new beginning, not just for the Miller family, but for all of Newport. The training center opened its doors not as a charity institution, but as a space for transformation and mutual growth. The mansion's old rooms, once silent witnesses to secrets and separations, now echoed with the sound of dreams being realized. In the workshop, young apprentices discovered their vocations under Emily's dedicated guidance. In the library, Sophie coordinated a reading incentive project for children from the community. Richard, observing everything from his office transformed into a community meeting room, finally understood his mother's true legacy. It wasn't just the Miller name or the business empire. It was the ability to build bridges, to transform pain into hope, to make love a revolutionary force. The emerald ring on Emily's finger shone with a new meaning. It was no longer a symbol of a kept secret, but of a liberating truth. A truth that had transformed not just a family, but an entire community. And so under Newport's blue sky, where the sea meets the land and where fishermen's stories intertwine with tales of old mansions, a new story began to be written. A story that proved that the strongest bonds are not those that tie us to the past, but those that propel us toward the future.